Okay, well, it's straight up
It's 7
7
o'clock.
p.m.
I think we're going to begin now. It is 7 o'clock, and I want to make sure we get a good early start. We have a speaker that is well known to many of you who have been coming to our Great Decision programs now for many years. Dr. Pierre Atlas, Robin Cohn will be introducing him. He's a very popular presenter, and he tends to bring his did you bring your class with you, Pierre?
I informed some of my students that I'm doing this. I don't know if they're on or not. So
Okay.
I didn't require it.
You could have given it a grade, yes.
They hear enough of me as it is.
Yeah. But welcome. We have a really exciting program tonight, and I know that you are all looking forward to it because of our speaker, and also because Iran is, and when is it not in the news? And it would be wonderful if it could be in the news for things.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, it would be great if Iran could be in the news for things other. May I please remind people, if you are not muted, will you please mute yourself now? If you are not muted, I'm seeing several people out there who are not. The background noise will really be pretty bad. So thank you so much. I think we're just going to get right on to it. I want to welcome you. This is Great Decisions. For many of you who come to two programs, you know that we have two Great Decisions and distinguished speakers. This is the Carl Gayweiler Great Decisions program. We are a good well into our series now. We are going to be running right into early May. This year we are funded by the Central Indiana Community Foundation, for which we are very grateful to have their support. And so my hat is off and a profound thank you for that support. We will leave our comments about if you're joining us and joining us and joining us again, to please consider membership because it just helps us really build our programs. As you know, we went virtual about 2 years ago. We thought we might go back, but we found that our audience expanded from way beyond Central Indiana, and it also gave an opportunity for our speakers to also come from a far field as well. And are we now sharing screen? Is that what we're doing? Bringing up? Is that what's just happened?
That wasn't me. That's
Okay.
not my screen.
Okay.
Someone
All right.
shared screen.
All right, I'm not quite sure what happened there. All right, so with that, I'm going to introduce Robin Cohn, who will please. Our questions this evening would be moderated by Ray Montano. And when Ray comes on, he will give further instructions as to what to do. We invite you to please ask your own questions. We're trying to move away from just, Ray will call on you, but we could read them from chat. But I think anybody who's a speaker really loves to have that live engagement with the speaker. We're not inviting you to give a speech. We are inviting you to please engage with our speaker and ask a question. It's really just a lot more fun. I took great pride in telling people that we did something that even Chautauqua, for those of you who know the really very famous Chautauqua Institute that has fantastic speakers. You go and you listen and you want to raise your hand and you want to engage and you can't. And as one of the recent CEOs said, that's for the front porch. People go back to their front porch. Well, you don't want to go back to their front porch. And so we offer you that robust Q&A engagement. We welcome you to take advantage of it. And with that, I'm going to ask Robin to please introduce our speaker this evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Betty, for introducing the program tonight. I will be talking about Pierre. Pierre Atlas is with the O'Neill School he joined in the fall of 2021. That's at IUPUI. He is a professor of political science and at Marian University for 17 years. He served as the founding director of the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies, where he created and directed Marian's interdisciplinary global studies program and its annual speaker series. So he has a lot of experience. At Marian, he taught courses in comparative politics, American politics, international relations, global studies, peace and justice studies, and criminal justice. He teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in the public affairs and criminal justice programs at O'Neill School. A comparative political scientist by training, he's devoted much of his academic career to studying and writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and other conflicts and conflict resolution. More recently, his comparative research and publications have examined how the legacy of the North American frontier helps to explain contemporary political differences between the United States and Canada on issues such as indigenous policy and the role of government in gun laws and gun culture. Dr. Atlas writes a monthly opinion column for the Indianapolis Business Journal, and before that was an opinion columnist for the Indianapolis Star for 16 years. A native of Texas, he grew up in California and is a U.S. Army veteran. Thank you, Dr. Atlas, for your service to our country, and I welcome you to Great Decisions this evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Let me go ahead and share my screen and get this going here. Okay, and let me sort of adjust my screen so I can see what I am doing. All right, this actually, by my calculation, I think this is the 19th or perhaps even the 20th year that I've done a Great Decisions talk for ICWA. I looked back and I saw all the different files that I have. It went back at least 19 years. I think it's longer than that because I didn't necessarily have PowerPoint slides in the first few years that we're doing this. In addition to being a senior lecturer at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at IUPUI, as Robin said, I've been here for 2 years after 20 plus years at Marion as a political science professor. I also have a faculty affiliation with the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University in Bloomington. But I am speaking on my own for this. So what I'd like to do tonight is we're going to talk about Iran and the topic from the Great Decisions book. And I know some of you are following the Great Decisions program and you have the book and you've probably read the article. The topic is actually called Iran at the Crossroads. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. I will go over fairly briefly some basic geography and demographics of Iran. Then I'll look at the roots of U.S. Iranian animosity, the strategic significance of the Persian Gulf, and the challenges posed by Iran to the region and to U.S. foreign policy. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that, sort of giving an overview of the relationship and the American perspective in foreign policy in the Gulf as it relates to Iran over time and Iran's role there. And then I'm going to talk about the killing of Mahsa Amini, what's basically being referred to as a new revolution in Iran that's taking place, prospects for regime change and democratization in Iran. I am not an Iran expert. I have studied American foreign policy in the region for a very long time. I have a sort of a pretty good general knowledge of the Middle East and Iranian modern history. But for a lot of this, particularly the section on this final section related to what's going on now, I'm actually going to be relying on some really interesting Iranian diaspora scholars who have been speaking about this recently. And I'm going to be sort of reflecting and quoting some of the things that they said, as well as my own understanding of what's going on. And then finally, we'll end with Q&A. I said type your questions in the chat, but as Betty said, frankly, it sounds like, which is nicer, you guys will be able to ask your own questions and we'll have a conversation. So let's get going, and I'm going to go through the material. First of all, where Iran is, here's, I think we all know, but just to be sure, I mean, this is Iran as it relates to the Middle East and Africa. On the other hand, here's Iran as it relates to Asia. And as you can see, Iran its geopolitical location is very significant on the Persian Gulf, on the Caspian Sea. At one point during the what we used to call the global war on terror, America had hundreds of thousands of combat troops basically on either side of Iran's borders in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And so from an Iranian perspective, you might see that as sort of an encirclement type thing. You can also see how close it is, frankly, to other important areas, including Russia and China and some other things that we can sort of talk about a little bit. Iran's place in sort of an emerging alliance with other non-democracies challenging the United States and some other places as well. Some very basic data on Iran, about 87 million people. The median age is 31.7 years old. More than half, in other words, more than half of the population of Iran is under the age of 30. So I've seen some figures as high as 60% under the age of 30. And it's a Muslim country. I mean, there are a few non-Muslim minorities, Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, Baha'i, but very, very tiny. Together, they don't even amount to 0.5% of the population. It is predominantly Shia and a smaller minority of Sunni Muslims, but it is a ethnically diverse country. The majority of the population are of Persian ethnicity, but you also have Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Balochs, Turkmen, and even some other groups as well. It's a highly literate country, highly educated. As you can see, the literacy rates are really quite astounding. And it is sort of a low to medium income country. In terms of sort of the ethnic and religious sectarian aspect, I find this map kind of interesting. I do not want to oversimplify, Shia versus Sunni, because frankly, there's so many other factors that are involved in how countries and people conceptualize themselves and how they behave on the international stage. That said, Iran does project, since the revolution, project a lot of power, and it has linked itself up with and supported Shia movements in other places. And as you can see, Iran and Iraq both have majority Shiite populations, as does Bahrain. And Lebanon is most likely a majority Shiite today. They haven't had an official census since 1932, but in all likelihood it is. And there's a we'll talk about this later on, but the role of Iran, of revolutionary Iran in supporting particular groups, including some destabilizing groups in the region, very much is linked to groups that have Shia backgrounds or connections with Shia Islam as well. And so that's something that certainly affects the way a lot of people in the region look at it, including the Saudis, including the Iranians. A lot of people do see this as a Shia-Sunni tension, as well as more of a geopolitical struggle for power and position. The roots of mutual mistrust and animosity between the United States are fairly recent in terms of world history. And really, there are two particular events that really signify the beginning of the bad relationship between the United States and Iran, between the governments, not between the people. And what I want to make clear throughout my talk is when I'm talking about the Iranian regime, I'm talking about the regime that came into power in 1979 with the revolution. The Iranian people most Iranian people have a very strong sense of interest in the United States. There's a lot of people who like the United States. A lot of Iranians have relatives living in the United States, but it's the regime itself which is not accountable to the people in a really true free and fair democratic elections. But anyway, the results of the roots of the animosity for Iran, it really begins in 1953 when the CIA and the British intelligence backed a coup that overthrew the democratically elected Iranian government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was an Iranian nationalist, and he made the mistake of trying to nationalize the oil industry and take it away from Great Britain. It was a lot of people were convinced inaccurately that he was a communist. The CIA and the British intelligence staged a coup. They overthrew his regime or his government and reinstalled the Shah in power. And then after that, the United States in particular backed the Shah, who became increasingly draconian and repressive in his rule until the revolution in 1979. Most Americans became aware of Iran in 1979 with the revolution, and particularly with the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the taking of American hostages, the humiliation of them on television, and they're being held in office for 444 days. By coincidence, it was the day they were taken happened to be election day of 1979. It was the beginning of basically people went into the American voting booths and they were very much aware, and I remember this, this was the first year I voted, very much aware of the fact that as you're voting for president in the United States, American hostages have just been taken. And I don't know to what extent that affected the election, but it certainly didn't help Jimmy Carter. And then the hostage situation carried forward until hours after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, and the Iranians waited until Carter had left as a further humiliation of Carter, and the hostages were released, although all of them were released alive, none of them were killed. And so that's something that Carter can certainly look back on. But the animosity really goes back to these two key events: 1953 for Iranians, and 1979 for the United States. The Iranian Revolution and its continuing legitimacy to this day was and is based in large part on anti-Americanism. Death to America is a very central part of the regime's narrative, as well as opposition to Israel's existence. So a lot of the official protests, death to America, death to Israel, things like that. From the United States perspective, Iran is viewed as a major supporter of terrorism in the Middle East and around the world. And it is the major strategic threat to American interests in the Middle East and to America's allies in the Middle East, Israel and several Arab states as well. In preparing this, I went back and I was reminded that 10 years ago, my Great Decisions talk was on Iran. And the Great Decisions book chapter on Iran was written by John Limbert. And the article then was called Iran and the U.S., 3 Decades of Futility. And I just want to take a minute and sort of quote what was said 10 years ago in the Great Decisions book about the U.S.-Iranian relationship. For the past 30 years, Limbert wrote, Washington's complaints about Iran have remained constant. The Islamic Republic supports terrorism and terrorist groups, opposes the Middle East peace process, opposes American interests in the region, ignores its obligations under international agreements on nuclear weapons, and has an appalling human rights record. Of course, Tehran has its own list of grievances against the U.S. And then that chapter from 10 years ago goes on to say, attempts to end this long estrangement have not fared well. Faced with failure and frustration, each side becomes confirmed in its prejudices and more strongly convinced that it is the reasonable one and that the other is simply too irrational, domineering, arrogant, duplicitous, etc., for any deal to be possible. Not that much has changed in 10 years. And if anything, it's probably gotten worse. But I think that was sort of interesting just to sort of put that in a historical perspective. Now, I'd like to spend a bit more time on the U.S. foreign policy and Iran. And from an American perspective, the reason Iran is of such great interest, frankly, is the Persian Gulf and access to oil. That goes all the way back to World War II as well. I mean, so Iran and Iraq, for that matter, both countries have been very much in the forefront of American foreign policy for decades, largely because of oil and because of the Persian Gulf. More than 50% of the world's proven oil reserves are located in the Persian Gulf region. And the Straits of Hormuz, the narrow straits, as you can see that I've circled in the second map between the UAE or Oman, excuse me, Oman and Iran, and into the Persian Gulf. About 20% of oil traded 20% of worldwide trade of oil flows through the Straits of Hormuz every day. So this is of a very strong strategic interest for geopolitics, for economics, and it always has been. So let me kind of go through this a little bit. During the Cold War, when the Shah was in power, the United States approached the Middle East with what was called the Nixon Doctrine. And the American position was what we called over the horizon. And basically, the United States did not deploy military forces in the Middle East. Instead, it relied on proxies in the Persian Gulf to protect American interests. And those proxies were Saudi Arabia and the Shah's Iran. And they were known as the twin pillars of America's interest in projecting America's interest in the Middle East. It related to oil and also related to containing the Soviet Union in the Middle East. The U.S. at the time called the Shah of Iran the policeman of the Gulf. He was a reliable U.S. ally, which also, by the way, underscores the animosity towards the United States that drove the Iranian Revolution, not just for Islamists, but also for seculars, for Marxists. A lot of people saw the United States government as having exploited Iran, reinstalled the Shah, tremendous amount of animosity towards the United States because of all of that. So from an American perspective, the U.S. relied on the Shah, and from a local internal Iranian perspective, the Shah was a brutal leader who was doing America's bidding. In 1980, so in 1979, actually, 2 major momentous events take place in that part of the Middle East, or that part of the region. One is the Iranian Revolution, and very shortly after that is the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, there was a lot of concern that they might not stop in Afghanistan. Iran was in the middle of a revolution. There was a tremendous amount of turmoil. And there was a concern that the Soviets might try and exert influence over Iran, or perhaps even go into Iran and try and seize the Persian Gulf. It was in response to that in January of 1980. Remember, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan right around Christmas of '79. In January of 1980, President Carter gave a speech and he declared the Persian Gulf for the first time to be officially a vital interest of the United States, and vowed to use U.S. military force if necessary to defend it, and he reinstituted the registration for the draft. Anyone in this audience, any of my students age 18 and over has to register for the draft. It goes back to this particular moment in time. This became known as the Carter Doctrine. The Iran-Iraq War, which broke out in 1980, launched by Saddam Hussein, who tried to portray and fairly effectively portrayed the war as a Sunni versus Shia and Arab versus Persian conflict to try and get the Arab world to support him. That war becomes the bloodiest war in the history of the Middle East. Over 1 million people were killed in it, of the history of the modern Middle East, I should say. Over 1 million were killed, about 500,000 on each side. During this period, President Reagan invokes the Carter Doctrine to reflag Kuwaiti tankers to protect them going through the Persian Gulf, to make sure that the oil will get through, even as Iranians and Iraqis are killing each other. And so this was the first time really that the Carter Doctrine is imposed, and ironically, it's by Ronald Reagan. Carter creates what's called the Rapid Deployment Force, which develops into Central Command. And this is for the first time in American history, the United States builds its own permanent military capacity to defend the Gulf and to deter the revolutionary Iran. In 1990, as we all know, Iraq invades Kuwait, threatens the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the world's largest proven oil reserves. The Gulf War is fought under United Nations resolutions and greatly reduces Saddam Hussein's power to the benefit of Iran. Every time Iraq's power has been diminished, the regional benefactor of that has been revolutionary Iran. After the Gulf War, the United States establishes permanent basing in Saudi Arabia for the first time, in part to enforce all of the different UN sanctions on Iran, the no-fly zones, all of those kinds of things. Later, this becomes one of the major grievances for Osama bin Laden, who says that there are infidels stationed in the land of the two holy mosques, meaning Saudi Arabia. And then eventually he declares war or jihad against the United States in 1996 and again in 1998. One of the major grievances he has that he cites in these documents is the fact that there are American troops stationed in Saudi Arabia. And this comes out of the Gulf War, and it comes out of really the Carter Doctrine and the essential nature of the Persian Gulf as a vital American strategic interest. In the 1990s, Clinton changes the doctrine to what he called dual containment. And now instead of twin pillars of defense, now there are two threats: Saddam Hussein's Iraq, who is diminished but still there, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in order to facilitate dual containment, our permanent basing of military in the Gulf increases. And in 1995, the Fifth Fleet headquarters, the Fifth Fleet is reconstituted, and its headquarters are established in Bahrain. And now we have a permanent U.S. Navy fleet whose mission is to provide Persian Gulf security and police the Persian Gulf. So now it's the United States in some ways as the policeman of the Gulf, as opposed to the Shah of Iran. This is Central Command and its area of responsibility. And as you can see, it encompasses parts of the Middle East as well as Central Asia, with Iran being snap dab in the middle of it. Both the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War after 9/11 were commanded and directed from Central Command or CENTCOM. Some more recent developments just to kind of go through this and address this. So the recent developments since 9/11 have further increased tensions between the United States and Iran. After a brief opportunity to actually cooperate after 9/11 against the Taliban, that was squandered in part by the Bush administration's refusal to engage with Iran and actually to bring Iran into what President Bush called the axis of evil. And that sort of fed into the hardliners in Iran who did not want to be cooperating with the United States anyway. Again, the sort of mutual animosity, mutual mistrust makes things worse. And from this point forward, we get into the Iraq War, which began in 2003, officially ended in 2011. I have a question mark because in some ways it's still going on in various forms. Obviously, ISIS comes into effect later on as well. With Saddam Hussein being removed from power and the mismanagement of the war, Iran organized and supports Shia militias in Iraq. And really the major benefactor of the defeat of Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam, the major benefactor was Iran. In fact, you could even sort of say who won the Iraq War? Iran won the Iraq War. The Syrian civil war that broke out during the Arab Spring, so far over 500,000 people have been killed. Within about the first year and a half of the war, it looked like Bashar al-Assad's regime was going to collapse, and then Iran came to the rescue with Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese militia that it supports and trains, and basically came and propped up Assad's regime. And Assad has been pretty much victorious, has taken over much of the country with the help of Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which I'll talk about in a minute, Hezbollah, and Russia. In 2015, President Obama negotiated and signed the JCPOA, which is the nuclear agreement with Iran, and the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany. It was working for a while, but it was politically unpopular, especially in certain parts of American politics. And President Trump withdrew from it after he became president, imposed new sanctions on Iran. I'll talk about what's happened recently with regards to that in a minute. Another factor is the civil war in Yemen, which broke out in 2014, and it quickly became a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Iran supporting the Houthi rebels, who are also Shiites, although they're a different sectarian aspect of Shiism as opposed to Iran. They're fivers as opposed to 12ers. But Iran has been supporting the Houthis largely because the Houthis are anti-Saudi, and this is a way to sort of leverage their power struggle. So far, well over 300,000, perhaps as many as 400,000 people have died in the Yemeni civil war. Estimates are 150,000 or so from the war itself, and the rest from famine, including tens of thousands of children have died from the famine as well. And this is a relentless war in which Iran and Saudi Arabia are deeply involved in it. And then what's interesting is that Iran has come to be seen as a common threat that has actually been drawing Arab states and Israel closer together. The Abraham Accords, the so-called Abraham Accords, in which Israel has had normalization relationships with United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, also Morocco and the Sudan, largely came about, I would argue, and I'm not alone in this, because of Iran. The idea that any kind of tension or distrust or animosity between Arab states and Israel was trumped by the greater concern about Iran. As a geopolitical rival, as a major regional power, as a Shiite radical revolutionary Islamic state, whatever you want to call it, basically, and as a country that doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist and threatens to wipe it off the map in its rhetoric. All these kinds of things led to the Abraham Accords, to a closer relationship between Israel and the Arab states, and I would argue a de facto alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has not formally entered any kind of agreement with Israel, but there's a lot of below the surface cooperation that's going on. All of this is because they see Iran as a common threat. And I would argue also that a lot of this happened because the United States was actually becoming less interested in the Middle East with its more concern and its pivot to China. And when all of this happened, basically, I think a lot of Arab states and Israel came to realize we have to sort of do this stuff on our own. We can't count on the United States so much anymore. And so all these things have happened, and Iran has been a pivotal player in all of this. One of the major forces that projects power in the region and engages in terrorism, according to the United States, and also increasingly according to the European Union and Great Britain and some other countries as well, is the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has funded, trained, and armed Hezbollah in Lebanon since the 1980s. Basically, after the Iranian Revolution, the IRGC started going into areas where Shiites were a strong force, starting in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, and basically started establishing proxy relationships. They helped form and arm Shia militias in Iraq. They supply weapons to Houthis in Yemen. They support the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, one of the smaller factions, but still pretty deadly in Gaza. The IRGC has provided critical aid to Assad in the Syrian civil war, both actual troops and also training and other types of things, helping to prop up Assad's regime and making the mass killing of Syrian civilians possible. And they are using violence and intimidation against Iranian protesters, including women today. Dr. Shireen Ebadi, who I'll be quoting later, she was on this webinar that I mentioned earlier just a few days ago. She was a 2003 Nobel Peace Prize winner. One of the things that she said on the webinar, which I took note of, was she said sanctioning the IRGC would make it much easier for the Iranian people to succeed in their protests and bring democracy to Iran. So Iranian Democrats in the diaspora, as well as within the country itself, also see the IRGC as a major source of power for the regime. It controls upwards of 2/3 of the Iranian economy. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of control. And in fact, one of the points that's made in the Great Decisions book that some of you read for tonight is that the Revolutionary Guard Corps is actually potentially a force of its own, perhaps even independent from the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei. And if he were even overthrown, what would happen to the IRGC? They are still there, and they have a tremendous amount of power. And so the idea that somehow you just transition to a democracy while they are still there is a questionable scenario at best. Quickly moving forward, so there are some geopolitical and military challenges taking place today as we speak, two in particular. Iran's nuclear enrichment following the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal increased rapidly, and just within a few days ago, it was reported by the IAEA that they've reached 85% of enrichment. You need to get up to 90% for nuclear weapons capacity, and this chart shows you the amount of 20% enriched uranium stockpile that existed before, during, and after the United States entered and left the agreement. Another thing that Iran is doing that is of tremendous concern to the United States and frankly to the democratic world is its strong support for Russia in the invasion and war in Ukraine. And as we all know, Iran has been supplying a lot of drones, including kamikaze suicide drones, to Russia that they have been using against Ukrainian civilians. So this is another major factor. So the Russian-Iranian military relationship, which was also being forged in Syria, is being forged even deeper with Ukraine. Iran is also starting to increase its ties with China as well. So from a geostrategic perspective, there is a major challenge. Okay, what I'd like to do now is spend the rest of my talk, the next few minutes, moving from sort of the global geopolitical aspect and U.S. foreign policy in Iran to some internal developments in Iran itself, and some of the challenges to the regime. First, I'd like to actually bring in some of the points from the chapter on Iran by Lawrence Potter for tonight from the Great Decisions book. As Potter points out, Iran today is riven by serious domestic problems. They include mismanagement of the economy, widespread corruption, and continuing brain drain due to a lack of opportunity. During the COVID pandemic, the regime, I would argue, was wearing ideological blinders, and those blinders led it to refuse to accept or import vaccines from the West, including the mRNA vaccines. And according to Potter's chapter, there were about 7.5 million COVID cases, over 145,000 deaths due to COVID, largely unvaccinated. The overwhelming majority of Iranians live in urban areas, but as Potter points out, the lack of jobs, housing, and entertainment in cities has led to serious discontent. Women make up about 60% of university students, but they are chafing under extreme restrictions of personal and bodily autonomy that were imposed literally within days of the revolutionary regime coming to power in 1979 and have been increased over time. And there are other problems as well that Potter points out. More than 1/3 of Iranians are living in poverty today. There are extremely high rates of drug addiction in the country. The regime recently dropped its subsidies for food and medicines, which caused a lot of hardship for ordinary Iranians, and inflation is running at over 50%. Most Iranians, as I said before, you're looking at least 50% of the people are under the age of 30. Most Iranians have no memory of life under the Shah, and all they know is the Islamic regime and its harsh restrictions and its authoritarian nature. So when the regime justifies itself in the revolution and in overthrowing the Shah and in overthrowing America's influence, most Iranians have no physical memory of any of that. All they know is the regime of the Ayatollahs. And this I find fascinating. This is a quoting from the article. In July of 2022, a survey was conducted, and this was before the killing of Mahsa Amini and the mass protests that have been taking place in September. And in that survey from July, half of the respondents aged 18 to 29 said they would leave the country if they could. That is sort of the backdrop to what's been happening recently. And that is the regime's killing of Mahsa Amini and its aftermath. And I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this. And obviously the young girl in the center is Mahsa Amini, 22 years old, and she was beaten to death by the so-called morality police of the Iranian regime for the crime of improperly wearing her hijab so that some of her hair was exposed. And she was an Iranian Kurd who had gone to Tehran to visit some family, and basically was just arrested and beaten to death. And she was not alone. She's not the first that this has happened to, but it sparked something in Iranians. This led to really an explosion of protest. And what's been really striking about this is that we're talking about the largest and most widespread demonstrations since the actual 1979 revolution, larger than any of the other revolutions or movements, including the 2009 so-called Green Revolution against the election results. Young people, and especially young women, as young as high school and college students, have taken to the streets in over 100 cities, towns, and villages. Many girls are publicly refusing to wear their hijabs, or they're publicly cutting their hair as a form of protest. The main slogan of this protest is Women, Life, Freedom. To date, approximately 540 protesters have been killed by security forces, including at least 70 children. More than 20,000 people have been arrested by the government in 130 cities and towns and at scores of universities. At least 4 people have been executed so far for charges of violence against the regime, including at least one who was publicly hanged. And the regime has been imposing widespread internet blackouts all over the country. Now, what's different about these protests? And yes, the protests have dwindled, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So, but what's different about these protests from others? Well, I'm bringing in some material from the Great Decisions book, and also from a recent lecture given by Roya Hakakian, who is an Iranian dissident and poet who gave a lecture at Indiana University just a few days ago. And I'm going to go ahead and these are the facts I'm sort of giving you are from these two sources. The protests, what's different about these protests from previous ones? One, the protests cut across all of Iran's ethnicities, not just Persians, but Kurds, Baluchis, Arabs, and of course, Amini was a Kurd herself, but it was not seen as an attack on Kurds. It was seen as an attack on Iranian women and on freedom. Unlike previous protests that had followed usually bogus elections and election results, and the claim was, we don't recognize this new president, or we feel our vote was stolen, and they were criticizing and attacking the newly elected president or the electoral process. These protests are directly challenging the legitimacy of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and they are challenging the legitimacy of the entire regime. And this has not been done publicly en masse before. Popular chants that have been heard on the streets and in these protests: death to the dictator, a twist on death to America. And we don't want an Islamic Republic. I mean, this is quite a thing in these mass protests. Protests have been taking place throughout the country, not just in big cities, including in the birthplace of the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, the original Ayatollah who led the revolution in 1979, who came to power with the revolution. And then a point that the author of our chapter makes is, he says, Islam per se is not the issue. Remember, 99% of the country are Muslim. The protesters are against the clerical system of government imposed after the revolution. They are not challenging the faith. They are challenging the regime that uses faith to maintain its power and suppress others. Another set of information I want to bring in is from this absolutely fascinating 90-minute webinar, and I have the link here, and I can make it available, I guess, to ICWA as well. And this took place on February 19th. And it was a webinar actually based in Australia, and it was broadcast around the world with Dr. Shireen Ebadi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, Gloriz Gaharaman, who is an Iranian immigrant to New Zealand, who was elected as a member of parliament in New Zealand, and Dr. Nagar Partau, who's at Massey University, and she's a Middle East security expert. And I'm going to sort of distill some of the things that they said, which I thought was very useful in talking about what's going on right now. Again, it's being called the Women, Life, Freedom Revolution. And by the way, all 3 of these women, as well as the women I cited before, they are all part of the Iranian diaspora. They are all highly educated women who are very much involved in supporting the protests and urging and calling for democracy in Iran. So the New Zealand member of Parliament said quite clearly, and this is a member of Parliament in New Zealand, the goal of this revolution is overthrowing the whole regime and replacing it with a multi-party democracy. Dr. Pato said the future of all we're talking about what democracy might look like in the future. She would say it must be inclusive of all voices and all ethnicities. So all of the minority ethnicity groups, as well as Persians, everybody needs to have a voice. LGBTQ has to have a voice. Everybody has to have a voice in a future democratic Iran. They were perhaps optimistic, but they were talking about what they're envisioning for the future. What were some of the most interesting things that I found were some of the comments by Dr. Abadi, the former Iranian judge who was fired after the revolution and then continued to work as a lawyer and then was actually imprisoned for a while by the regime and then fled and then won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. She said what's going on today is really a revolution of women and young people against the Islamic regime. She took some time to review the long list of gender discrimination laws that were imposed literally beginning days after the revolution and the regime came into power in 1979. And she noted that women have been protesting for a long time, since 1979, in smaller numbers, but they've largely been ignored by women and by the rest of the world. The gist of it, though, is that what she said in looking at and reviewing how women are treated by the regime since 1979, basically women have been turned into second-class citizens by the revolution. And a couple of direct quotes that I thought were very interesting. She said, the revolution has started again, and like all revolutions, it has its ups and lows. The final demand of the revolutionaries is that this regime has to go. And then finally, in discussing the movement and also in the context of talking about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as well, she said, once we have democracy in Iran, the whole region will be calmer and peaceful. And this is where I guess sort of the internal elements and developments in Iran and the geostrategic issues and the challenges to American foreign policy in the region all sort of come together. Obviously, there are a lot of other factors besides the Iranian regime, but the Iranian regime itself is we might call a bad actor for its own people, most specifically, but also for the region as well. Some final comments on the current situation that I'd like to make. The Iranian regime's mass arrests, violence against its own people, and internet blackouts have definitely calmed down the protests in recent weeks. Today, we've gone from open mass protests to what might be called quiet protests that are still taking place, but not the mass protests that we've seen in the media in the last few months. But I would argue, and I'm not alone, obviously, in this, the cat is out of the bag. And it is really implausible to imagine that there could be a return to the status quo ante, the situation before the killing of the murder of Amini. Frankly, because the overwhelming majority of Iranians no longer recognize the legitimacy of the Iranian regime, its leaders, or perhaps even the Iranian Revolution itself. However, Iran is not Iraq in 2003. If we talk about regime change, it has to be internally driven, and frankly, probably shouldn't even use the word regime change because of all of its baggage going back to the Iraq War. I would argue, and especially after listening to these diaspora Iranian women activists, that any kind of change must be Iranian driven from within by those on the ground and from without by the very sophisticated, well-organized and vibrant Iranian diaspora. I'm going to end again with this quote that I found very striking from Dr. Abadi's talk from February 19th. Once we have democracy in Iran, the whole region will be calmer and peaceful. That might be optimistic. The Iranian regime is not the only cause of issues in the Middle East. There are many, many factors that are going on, but clearly it has been instigating a lot of problems. It is brutalizing its own people. It is a regime that's only 4 decades old. We have to understand that Iran is a 2,500-year-old civilization. The current regime is only about 43, 44 years old, okay? And most Iranians don't remember anything before it. And these are very important factors to keep in mind as we think about the future. And that's my talk, and I'm happy to have a conversation, answer your questions, and hear what you guys have to say. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much, Pierre. I'll try to manage this Q&A session here. If you have a question, just send a line directly to me, Ray Montagno. And if you want to ask the question yourself, I will call on you in the order the questions are received. And if you'd like me to read the question, I will do that as well. But maybe we could start. I just have a question to start with. This has to do with Iran's strategy about nuclear weapons. What is the kind of the long-term goal of this? I mean, obviously they know that China, Russia, and the United States have had nuclear weapons for decades now, and this whole notion of mutually assured destruction they must understand this. And if they attack Israel with nuclear weapons, they would receive them in return. So what is sort of their goal with nukes?
Well, I can't get into the head of the regime leaders, but I can make a couple of observations. Interestingly enough, Ayatollah Khomeini, before he died, and he died in 1989, so sometime before then, he had actually said, and I believe he even issued as a fatwa, if I'm correct, that nuclear weapons were fundamentally un-Islamic because of their indiscriminate nature. And the Quranic understanding of waging war is actually fairly similar to just war doctrine in terms of how you have to distinguish between legitimate targets and non-combatant. And the very idea of nuclear weapons it violates the basic tenets of Islam. That's an interesting thing. You don't hear too many leaders today making that point, but that's something that Ayatollah Khomeini said. In terms of absolutely, I agree. I mean, obviously, everybody knows that Israel has nuclear weapons, even though they haven't declared it. If they were to use weapons against Israel, in all likelihood, there would be sort of a mutually assured destruction type thing. Nuclear weapons, though, obviously they haven't been used since 1945, and the cachet of the weapon is in the prestige and the power and the threat that comes from it. And from a kind of a realist international relations perspective, you could make an argument that it actually is rational for Iran to want to have nuclear weapons, especially given the context of a few years ago when you had tens of thousands of American combat troops basically on two of its borders. And if you want to deter an invasion, have nukes. I mean, the lesson basically is North Korea had them, Iraq didn't. Look what happened to Iraq. Look what has not happened to North Korea. I am not making an argument that Iran should have nuclear weapons or that they should go for them. But from a strategic perspective, you can say at that level, there's a rationality for it. On the other hand, if they were to actually acquire nuclear weapons, it would inevitably start a nuclear arms race in the region. And it's already been quite clear. The Saudis have basically said that if Iran gets nukes, they will go for them as well. And they don't have to build them. They just go buy them from Pakistan. And they will get their own. Egypt might go for some as well. Turkey might feel the need. And you would have a nuclear arms race, and the arms race itself becomes destabilizing. And none of the countries really have, there is no nuclear deterrence between two nuclear powers in the region. And so there is no record of cooperation and communication. I mean, we in the United States and Soviet Union got past the threat, the very realistic possibility of thermonuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 by setting up the hotline and communication and reducing uncertainty. I cannot imagine a situation where Iran and Israel would do that, where they would have those kinds of communication to make sure that we're not going to launch weapons against each other. So the destabilization of introducing nuclear weapons into the region would be very dangerous. Even if Iran has no intention of using them. One argument that has been made, and now this is my last point, is that a lot of people who study this have suggested that the regime doesn't necessarily want to acquire nuclear weapons, but they want to acquire the capacity to race for it very quickly if the need is there. And the fact that the closer they get, the more threatening they become without necessarily having warheads to mount on top of ballistic missiles, right? So there's a lot of factors that are going on in there. And again, I mean, who knows? There's also potentially one of the fears is there a non-rational aspect, sort of a messianic Shiism of hastening the day of judgment by basically setting off a sort of an Armageddon type situation. Some people believe there may be some people in the Iranian regime who think like that, but they are probably a very small minority. Those are some of the answers to that question, which is a pretty good question.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Ken Holland, you out there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, Ken.
Hi, Ken.
Yeah. Hey, Pierre. Let's see. Here we go. Here I am. So as you know, my wife Julie and I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and we have hundreds of Afghan students, professors, security guards who are trying to leave the country. And one obvious place for them to go is Iran. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about why Iran's not been that welcoming to these Afghan refugees, and whether that policy might change in the future, because as you know, there's a large Shia minority in Afghanistan.
That's a great question. I honestly don't know why they would be unwelcoming. I mean, it could be the fact that they're not Iranian. There may be a concern that maybe some Taliban might sneak in with them. Maybe they just don't want to be dealing with Afghanistan in that sense. That's a really good question. Perhaps just the idea of bringing in refugees can be destabilizing. And interestingly, Iran has not really been a place where refugees have sought refuge. And so it's an interesting dynamic. I'm wondering, I'm going to throw the question back to you. Have you heard any answers from people, your former students and faculty that are trying to get in and that are being denied? Do they have any understanding as to why they're not being taken in?
Yeah, what we hear is that many of them do try to cross the border into Iran, but they have a really terrible experience. What they tell us is that once they arrive in Iran, they're not given any documents. They're not allowed to stay in the country legally. They're not allowed to go to school. They're not allowed to take a job. And so what they try then to do is transit through Iran into Turkey. And then from Turkey, they do everything they can to get to Germany. You may have seen there was a boat recently that sank off the coast of Italy.
Yes,
and many
horrible.
of the refugees on that boat were Afghans who had come through Turkey. So I think many of them would like to stay in Iran, but Iran has not been welcoming at all. And so basically the ones who do work in Iran are part of the informal economy, you know, doing manual labor. So it's not a good situation for them.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's very interesting. I wish I had an answer. That's something I think we could look into. And you know, why is that a government policy that they are so unwelcoming and hostile at the border? That's very interesting. I actually didn't know that the extent of that at all. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Sheldon, are you out there?
Mike Shackleton?
No. Well, you can go ahead. Sheldon, I saw his name up next, but go ahead, Michael.
I was at a conference a few months ago where the question came up as to what it would take to overthrow the government. And the chief comment that came back was they need an individual charismatic leader. Now they have a lot of unorganized mass demonstrations. And otherwise, there's a fear that it might peter out. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I didn't mention this in my talk, but one of the interesting features of the current revolution, or whatever you want to call it, again, it has sort of dissipated a little bit, is that it's leaderless. And it's basically been sort of a mass movement using word of mouth and social media to organize, but there really does not have any specific leaders involved. And that's an interesting thing. In general, I would just sort of say, given Iran's history, having a charismatic leader of the revolution may not be what the revolutionaries want today, because basically you had the revolution in 1979 was multifactional. You had everything from Islamists to the Bazari merchants to Marxist students, everybody. But they united around one charismatic leader who basically, once he achieved power, basically started taking out everybody else that was not aligned with his particular side for the Islamic Revolution. And a lot of the people who wanted to overthrow the Shah didn't necessarily want to have an Islamic Republic. So I think, I cannot imagine. And again, I'm not an expert on Iranian internal affairs to the beyond what I said. I cannot imagine that there's any particular charismatic leader that would cut across all the different sectors of society. And this is a multi-sectoral uprising that's taking place in Iran. Maybe, frankly, in some ways, what would be probably better is some type of a multi-ethnic political movement party in which people are represented. But of course, all of that is illegal in Iran. There are no political parties that would certainly be allowed for the revolutionaries. But I can't see a particular charismatic leader, and I would think, given Iran's history, there would probably be reluctance to rely on a particular charismatic leader. That's my gut instinct on that, my gut feeling.
Kind of a follow-up question to that from Sheldon. He told me to go ahead and read it. What can the West or the United States do to support the protests going on right now?
So as I said, I personally believe very strongly that it needs to be Iranian led and Iranian determined in terms of its direction. But I think there are things the United States can do. We have to be very wary, because frankly, whatever the United States does will be used, exaggerated, and lied about to basically paint the protesters and the revolutionaries as being American puppets, just like they, and giving the history that would resonate with some people and would certainly legitimize the regime. So we have to be very careful what we do. But I think more serious, sanctions against the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and now the European Union, I believe, is right now in the process of debating whether they're going to classify them as a terrorist organization and have lots of formal sanctions on them. That's a pretty important thing. Whatever we can do to separate them out, to make it more difficult for them to have this relationship with Russia, if that's possible. Those kinds of things I think we can do. We can certainly give moral support. We can give maybe financial support to some movements, maybe help facilitate connections between various Iranians in the diaspora around the world. But I think in some ways, the leadership needs to come from them. It cannot be America leading. What happened with the United States in Iraq, I think it's a lesson of what not to do, which is going to war for regime change. First of all, Iran is a much more larger, more sophisticated country than Iran. We would never want to go into Iran to try and overthrow the government. It has to be the people itself. But and it can't just be the United States. I think it really needs to be the United States, the European Union, the diaspora, the democratic world. And I would just say that something I've been thinking about a lot recently, given it's the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war and what's been happening. It seems to me that there is a intersectionality of authoritarianism in the world today, in which you have a lot of authoritarian regimes: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, in our hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and some other regimes as well around the world, who may not have a lot in common with each other ideologically or religiously or ethnically, but they are unified or becoming increasingly unified in their opposition to democracy at home, in their opposition to the United States and the European Union. And there's a lot of collaboration that's going on. There's direct military collaboration between Iran and the Russians in both Syria and now in Ukraine. And so those kinds of things. And I think in some ways where the United States could play a role, not so much in being seen as meddling in internal affairs in Iran, rather in coming to understand that there is this, in a sense, maybe a new kind of Cold War, but it's a Cold War between the democratic world, which is the United States, European Union, Japan, South Korea, other countries. Hopefully, one day, maybe we'll bring India in as well, versus this intersectionality of authoritarian regimes. And that may be a way to sort of diminish Iran's role in some ways down the line. That's a long-term goal. These are some of my general thoughts. I'm very, very wary, given what happened with the Iraq War, that the United States should not be seen as trying to lead a movement to overthrow the regime. That would be the worst thing we could do for the people who actually want to seek democracy in Iran.
All right, well, thank you. Betty, you want a question?
Yeah, I wanted to say quickly that to Ken's, why women or young people, but particularly women, want to go from Afghanistan into Iran, it's like wait for the frying pan into the fire. Pierre, I was in Lebanon in 2003, 2004, when Rafiq Hariri, the former prime minister, was blown up in his by a cell phone in his operated car bomb on the
Mhm.
Corniche. He was Sunni. And at the time, I thought I remembered that that there was an equal portion of Sunni and Shiite in Iran. I think the Hezbollah at that time, when there were massive marches, 1 million person march one week to throw Syria out, 1 million person march the next week by the Hezbollah. At the time, we were really supported by Syria. So are you saying now that it's Iran that has been heavily supporting the Hezbollah presence, which is growing but I think Parliament is also set up. So I think that factions can only grow by certain percentages within the Parliament. And can you also go back and say again why the women's movement has listed a bit? I heard you say.
I'll do that first. It's not just the women's movement. It was really an uprising.
Right.
And the only reason it's sort of come down a little bit is because of the very harsh response by the regime. 20,000 arrests, over 500 people have been killed by the regime. Some public executions. They're trying to shut down the internet entirely, which is a way of actually, again, it's a leaderless revolution and it's a way of organizing. But it hasn't disappeared. People are still doing things. They're still, quietly protesting. They're not wearing their hijabs. They're cutting their hair. They're doing other. But the idea of like literally thousands of people taking to the streets and setting fires and confronting and shouting, that has dissipated. Whether it's going to come back again in that form, who knows? But I don't think the disgust with the regime held by so many Iranians is not going to go away. So will it take a new form? Will another incident become another catalyst for more protests? Who knows? But the reason it's sort of calmed down is because of the very harsh response. And the regime's perspective is they will not let up. They will keep pushing, because one of the lessons from the Iranian Revolution was the Shah kept vacillating during the revolution between very, very harsh responses and easing up. And part of the easing up, by the way, was pressure from President Carter, who was saying you have to respect human rights. And so you get pressure from the United States to ease up. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have, but basically what that did was every time he eased up on repression, the revolutionary forces were able to fill the vacuum. The Revolutionary Guard today, the Iranian Islamic regime today, they are not doing it. And they've even made it very clear they are not going to let up. They will not give 1 inch to this. So it's what's going to happen next, we don't know. But as I said, the cat's out of the bag. Where there's no going backwards, in my view, and I certainly not in the view of a lot of Iranians. In terms of Hezbollah, Iran actually played a major role in creating Hezbollah in the 1980s. It comes into existence in the early 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War. It becomes one of the major Shiite factions. The Revolutionary Guards Corps actually goes to Lebanon very shortly after the revolution. And helps, and there were already Shiite militias going on, but the Iranians help organize them, help train them. When Israel invades Lebanon in 1982, they become a major fighting force against the Israelis. It's the precursor to Hezbollah, but what becomes Hezbollah is the organization that blows up the U.S. embassy and the French embassy and the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, killing 241 Marines. That's Hezbollah. And so Iran has always been there. Now with Syria, the Assad regime in Syria, they are Alawites, and Alawite is an offshoot of Shia Islam. It's a minority. It's an Arab minority in a largely Sunni Arab world, and as a minority, with sort of links to Shiism, the Iranian revolutionary regime was always supporting Assad, and so during the basically it was the only and Syria, by the way, because of this relationship, Syria was the only major Arab state that was supporting Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, where all the other Arab countries were lining up for Saddam Hussein. Part of that was geopolitics, and it was a very intense rivalry between Assad and Saddam. Assad's father and Saddam, they were both Baathists. But and all this, I want to get into. I don't want to dive too deep into the weeds. But the point I want to make is that the Iranian regime from 1979 forward has always had a very strong relationship with the Assads in Syria and with Hezbollah. Okay, And so going back to that map I showed in the beginning of where the Shiites are, this is where King Hussein, King Abdullah of Jordan, King Abdullah II of Jordan made this argument a few years ago where he used the term the Shiite crescent. And he made an argument that Iran is trying to establish a Shiite crescent across the Middle East from Iran through Syria into Lebanon. And Iraq, through Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And he made this argument. It maybe oversimplifies things, but that's where it sort of comes from. So you've always had this relationship. So what you were seeing in Lebanon was sort of elements of the Iranian-Syrian relationship with Hezbollah. And so then, of course, Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guards Corps from Iran both come to the rescue of Bashar al-Assad early on in the Syrian civil war when he's about to lose. I mean, he was, if you remember back in like 2013, around 2013 or so, people were predicting that Assad would be gone in 6 months. He was losing. What happened? Hezbollah, for the first time, leaves Lebanon and leaves the Israeli-Palestinian, Arab-Israeli conflict and enters an Arab country to fight. And they're fighting alongside the Syrians, as is the Revolutionary Guard Corps from Iran. And they prop up the Syrian Assad regime. And so that's what happens. And that's what you saw there. I mean, you saw, well, why did you, that's how you saw Syria and Iran. They had that relationship, and that's why they still have the relationship with the Assad regime today.
All right, well, thank you. Larry, you got a question?
Yes, thanks, Ray. And Pierre, as usual, outstanding presentation. Good to see you. You partially answered one of the questions I had, which was with the Revolutionary Guard still in place. Can you envision any scenario where a nonviolent overthrow or change of regime is possible? And since we've already talked about that a bit, you mentioned that it's a tenet of Islam not to support indiscriminate killing. Is there any way that they can rationalize selling drones to Russia to drop onto Ukrainian civilians under that tenet, or is that just pure, opportunity to work with Russia against the U.S. as a supporter of Ukraine?
So, well, Larry, to answer the second question, what I was referring to a specific statement that Ayatollah Khomeini made back in the 1980s. Okay. About him making an argument that nuclear weapons in particular violate the tenets of Islam. Now, whether anyone in the current regime, including Ayatollah Khamenei, who replaced Khomeini, whether he believes that, or whether anyone in the Revolutionary Guards Corps believes that, that's a totally separate thing. Okay. As for I mean, the idea of the indiscriminate killing part, again, that's reference really to that very narrow thing. Obviously, any kind of a weapon. I mean, frankly, the suicide drones are very small, and in terms of the amount of damage, I mean, frankly, I don't think they do as much damage as some very more sophisticated bombs would, which could also kill civilians as well. So I'm not sure. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't know how much thought has gone into that from a theological perspective. Frankly, in any theology, not just Islam, right? And then what was your first question again?
Well, it was more about the possibility of regime change with the Revolutionary Guard still in place. Do you see any scenario where a non-violent overthrow or change of regime could take place within Iran without this, this mass movement rising up violently against the current regime? They're not going to give way because a lot of people don't like them. they're going to stay in place until they're pushed out of power.
That is a really good question, and that might be the $64,000 question in terms of what may happen for the future of Iran, because the IRGC has such a vested interest, literally vested interest, including economic interests, in maintaining the status quo, and out of their own interests. I mean, even not even support for Islam. I mean, just basically. They're fairly corrupt in all of this. To what extent would they, they would not be voluntarily putting their arms down. I mean, a violent revolution would certainly be a horrific thing to imagine in a country of 70 million people. And when you see how the brutal violence that they've been willing to use against unarmed people, if they have the excuse of now we're actually fighting against these people we're going to call pro-American terrorists. Imagine what they would do. They would probably actually use some of the real serious military equipment against civilians and things like that. I would imagine, again, just sort of like putting on my comparative politics hat. I mean, frankly, very often revolutions succeed when the soldiers or the security forces make a decision not to fire into the crowd. And I think a lot of it would have to come down to, to what extent are younger members of the Guard Corps more attached to their peers? How can you sort of infiltrate them psychologically and culturally to kind of realize that you can't be supporting this anymore? How can you marginalize them? What can you do short of actual an armed conflict to overthrow the regime, which I think again would be very dangerous. And I don't think there are very many people on the pro change side that would want to see that happen, or they would want to pick up arms to do it. But you point out a very important factor that they are a major stumbling block. And they are very much, and they are also behind all of Iran's adventurism outside of their borders as well. If they start facing defeats in other places, if they start losing legitimacy, if a lot of Iranians come to see, including the ones not taking to the streets, that, hey, a third of our people are living in poverty, how much money is going to them to fight these wars elsewhere? They could, if they lose legitimacy, and the younger recruits, the younger members of the force back away, and maybe they're not willing to use violence against protesters that they know of their own generation. Those kinds of things could have an effect. But and again, this is all speculation, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but the idea of an armed revolution, an armed conflict between the Iranian people would be a horrific thing, and I don't see what would happen with that. I can't imagine.
Yeah, can I ask one more question before we go, Ray? Okay.
All right, cost you a cup of coffee though.
Okay, good.
Yeah, as a former leader of this group, you have a prerogative.
With the call it adventurism of the Guard outside of Iran, and they're supporting terrorist groups around the region, do you envision any colonial ambition by Iran? Are they seeking a new Persian Empire? I mean, how far afield do they want to go, or is it just shoring up the power, if you would, of other Shia Islamic groups in the region?
Well, you could when you say colonialism, we think of like physical control and governing of other places, but in some ways you could sort of think of the role that Iran is playing in Lebanon, in Syria, to a certain extent by influencing certain Shia parties and militias in Iraq as well. That it could be sort of a form of neocolonialism. In the sense that they are. Iran is a regional power, and this is something that the United States has to understand too. Iran is a regional power. Iran has always been a regional power. Iran is a 2,500-year-old civilization. They're not going anywhere. It's much more likely the United States is going to pull out of the Middle East, especially if oil becomes less important. Iran is not going anywhere. The current regime is only 40-something years old. Okay, but the idea of saying that Iran should not be projecting its power is a kind of an unrealistic thing for the United States to expect. The idea of Iran transitioning into a more democratic, less belligerent regime, less government, that's something else. Okay, but the Shah of Iran projected power, and so it's always been that way, and it's always and before then it was its geostrategic location. It was never occupied or colonized by other countries, but it was divided into both British and Russian spheres of influence. And that's one thing I'll point out that really interesting. Historically, Iran and Russia have been enemies for centuries. What's really interesting is that Iran and Russia today are allies. And the reason they're allies is because, as I said earlier, I think it's this intersectionality of authoritarianism. And it's the regimes. It's not so much the geopolitics and the classical 19th century geopolitics. It's really these two non-democratic, brutal authoritarian regimes that are both anti-democratic abroad and anti-democratic within their own borders, and that's why they're having this relationship, as well as in Syria. But I think it's sort of it mimics some elements of sort of a neo-colonialism, their ability to project their power, and not just their power, but to basically be deal makers or deal breakers in these various places. Hezbollah doesn't, Iran doesn't flip a switch and Hezbollah turns on, but they have a tremendous amount of influence with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has a very strong relationship with Iran. And so therefore Iran has a lot of influence in Lebanon. They have a tremendous amount of influence in Iraq, tremendous amount of influence in Yemen, in Syria, right?
All right, great. Hey, Bruce, you out there, you want to ask your question?
I'm out here, Ray. Thank you. Pierre, I haven't been here for all night, but I've heard 5. And each
We can't hear you, Bruce.
yeah, I haven't been here for all 19. I have heard 5 here, and each place is better. Congratulations. And following up on Larry's an impossible task at all times. Given the situation, the history of the United States with Iran, is there a role, or how would the United States, what role and how would they play that role in order to help a change in the region?
He kind of broke up. Ray, did you catch the whole question?
Well, I think he was asking about the leadership in the United States, whether or not it would, is there some elements of the U.S. government policy that are going to be positive towards Iran?
Yeah, what role can we play in order to catch the change that might be occurring in Iran in order to allow it to go to a completion? Given the history we have, the polarization that exists in our country.
I think if I get the gist of your question, I think that with the current regime the way it is, especially now with the regime being under pressure from its own people, the likelihood of any kind of positive relationship with Iran, I think in the short term is not there. Between what Iran is, what it's doing to its own people, and the fact that it's feeling, the regime is probably feeling kind of encircled and under attack by its own people. That combined with the fact that Iran has these very close ties and military ties with Russia and Ukraine, I don't see there's really any room. And even the President Biden had said we're going to start renegotiating the nuclear deal. That's off the table at this point. Iran is doing a lot of they're doing a lot of different issues, disrupting and destabilizing a lot of areas that the United States cares about. I just don't see anything happening positively for the near future. If at some point we start to see the regime lightening up, maybe on its people because of internal pressures or whatever, that might lead to something. But given especially what's happening with Russia, and given where we see Russia today, I don't see that happening. Now, if there's a change in the American administration, depending on if a Republican comes in, if it's a Republican who's not hawkish he's not from the more anti-Russian traditional American foreign policy perspective on Russia, if it's a more of an isolationist type person who comes in, there might be a lightening up of pressure on Russia. I don't know what that would do with the American relationship with Iran, but frankly, I don't think there's any politician in the United States of any party and any faction within any party that has any warm feelings towards the Iranian regime. Again, it goes back to 1979. So I just don't see in the short term any really options for positive things. Because frankly, the elections in Iran, the presidency, the way they're running things now, only hardliners are winning. There was a time back in around 9/11, before and after 9/11, with Khatami, where there was an opportunity for some warming of relations or thawing of relations when they had more a less hardline, more reformist-oriented leader, relatively speaking. But that option is long gone, and they're only going to be hardliners as long as the regime is in charge. And so I just don't see it, unfortunately.
All right, that's not very positive
Sorry.
view there, but Claire Collins, you got a question?
Claire.
Yeah.
You're muted.
You're on mute. Okay, there we go.
When has Russia ever passed up an opportunity to go into a destabilized situation and install their guy? And what would that what effect would that have on Ukraine? Or do you think that Putin would pass up the opportunity because, you know, he's busy with Ukraine?
Install his guy, what you mean in Iran? I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, I mean, an Iranian, but one that's favorable to Putin. You know, he does that with a lot of his satellites.
I don't think Putin or Russia has that kind of influence inside Iran. I think the influence they have is more in Iranian foreign policy, and frankly, Russia is not. In the eyes of Iranians, Russia is no more legitimate than America. And in fact, most Iranian people, or a lot of Iranian people, have a more positive image of the United States, especially young Iranians. But Russia is not seen as in a positive light by many people. They are a strategic ally for the regime. But in terms of Putin having influence on who might be selected in the Iranian regime itself, I don't think there's that thing. I will point out, though, it's really important. I mean, the reason Russia has turned to Iran is because Russia is doing so badly in Ukraine. I mean, Russia is going to a second tier military power, maybe even a third tier military power, to get equipment because they are losing on the battlefield. Now they may end up winning just by sheer, or they may end up gaining more territory in the future. But, you know, man for man, soldier for soldier, the Russian soldier is no match for the Ukrainian soldier. And they've been bloodied heavily. And that's why they're going beyond their own military industrial complex to seek weapons and everything and things from other people. I mean, it would have been a year ago when Russia was invading Ukraine, and we were all thinking that, you know, how many days will Kyiv last before it falls? Who could have imagined a year ago that Putin would go hat in hand to the Iranians to ask for drones to use against the Ukrainians? I mean, that would have been unimaginable. And they're getting weapons from North Korea too. Okay, so the fact that Russia needs, the irony is Russia needs Iran in a lot of ways that maybe Iran doesn't need Russia as much, although they have a good relationship in Syria and things like that, right? And both Russia also very strongly supported Assad because Russia has a naval base in Tartus in Syria, and that they had under the Assad regime. So Russia was supporting the Assad regime from the very beginning of the civil war, along with Iran, but they were not doing it because they shared any ideology. They certainly don't share any cultural or religious commonalities. It was pure geopolitics, realpolitik, common enemy, those kinds of things that were happening there.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Just a follow-up question that, and then we'll go to one more question from the audience, but follow-up question, does Iran have the resources to sustain support for Russia?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, in terms of building drones, I don't think that's necessarily a major thing. I mean, I think one of the questions is does it have the capacity to sustain all of their operations outside of the country, in Syria, particularly Yemen, things like that. Although, frankly, a lot of what they're providing is fairly low level type things. Iran is selling its oil. Right now, the largest purchaser of Iranian oil is China. And so as long as the oil is flowing and they're able to generate revenue, they can do that. And then Russia is buying the drones. I mean, they're paying for them, as far as I understand. They're not getting them for free. So it's not like they're saying, here, we're opening up our doors, we're giving you away, we're giving you all of these things. They're making money off of it, as far as I understand, and they are selling their oil to China, and so they're getting closer to China as well. Yeah. So I think that in that sense, it's not providing troops or anything like that. They're just happy to sell some weaponry, and it enhances Iran's prestige that its drones are being used by Russia, the country with the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. That Iranian drones are being used by Russia in their war against Ukraine and in their war against democracy against the West, which is what the Ukrainian war is. So all of that enhances the prestige of the regime in that sphere.
Yeah, okay, that's a good way to think about it. We have time for one more question. Durbins, do you want to ask your question there? You unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Excuse my voice, I have a bad cold. What, if any,
Okay.
impacts might there be to Iran as a refuge for Syrian victims from the most recent earthquakes, considering that the IRCG is actively involved in the Syrian civil war? And also, do you see any impacts of the rise of the extreme right politicians in Israel on Iran's policies? Will that just present an opportunity for Iran to use an old conflict to bolster its internal support?
Great question. Let me do the first one quickly. The area of Syria that was hit by the earthquake is an area that is not really under the Assad regime's control for the most part. So most of the victims are actually in areas that are still sort of like rebel-held or Kurdish areas. And so the Syrian regime, they're not really there. And frankly, the people that a lot of the victims are people that the Revolutionary Guard Corps would not really like very much, because they're mostly on the other side of the conflict. And in fact, the Assad regime was refusing to allow aid to go in because they were largely rebel-held areas. So that's sort of that's not really. So the issue of refugees going into Iran, that's not. I don't think that's really going to be there. As for the new government in Israel, yeah, I think I mean, you have the most hardline right-wing coalition government in Israel's history. They are doing a lot of things in the West Bank that are, I believe, going to potentially undermine Israel's security, and frankly, might even undermine the Abraham Accords that Israel has with some of the Arab states. Frankly, it could become harder for UAE, Bahrain to maintain a normalization with Israel if more and more Palestinians are being killed, or if, as some of the ministers in the government would like to do, they start expelling Palestinians or annexing territory. How far will Netanyahu allow his coalition to go? So those kinds of things could actually potentially undermine a lot of the positive developments that have been happening between Israel and countries in the Arabian Gulf. It's going to be even harder, perhaps potentially, for Saudi Arabia to maintain its de facto alliance with Israel if the Palestinian question becomes much, much worse than it is. Anything that Israel does that makes life worse for Palestinians plays into Iran's hands, because Iran sees itself as and it really is. Iran is the only frontline state in the Middle East confronting Israel. No Arab state is. Egypt has peace with Israel. There's not been an Arab-Israeli war, I mean, actual war between sovereign Arab states and the state of Israel since 1973. All right. And the Lebanon war was Israel going into Lebanon, fighting the PLO and fighting factions, but that was not really the nation of Lebanon against Israel. So the last Arab-Israeli formal interstate war was the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The only major country, the only country in the Middle East that has a formal confrontational warlike stance against Israel is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which vows to wipe it off the map, refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist anywhere, period. It's not a question of a two-state solution. They reject, they're complete rejectionists. So anything Israel does to undermine the peace agreements that are already very, very tattered anyway, to increase the hardships of Palestinians, killing Palestinians in conflict, anything like that plays into the hands of Iran, which and the ICR, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, is a strong supporter of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but the Iranian government actually provides funds to Hamas, okay, and to Hezbollah, and Hezbollah and Hamas have very strong relationship, even to the point where Hezbollah has been providing weapons to Hamas, including rockets. Okay, so all of these kinds of things, again, it's sort of there's an alliance against Israel of Iran and its proxies, in a sense, Hamas, which is Palestinian Sunni, and Hezbollah, which is Lebanese Shiite Arab. And so all of these things. So anything Israel does in my view, is actually going to, in a negative light or more kind of a right wing light, is going to increase Iran's. It's going to play into the hardliners, and it's also going to convince the Iranians even more so that they should not give up nuclear enrichment or maybe go for a weapon or anything like that. So, and of course, and by the way, everything that Iran does enhances the arguments of the hardline Israelis, because what they say is we live in a dangerous neighborhood. Imagine Hamas in the West Bank, where they would have rockets that could reach every part of Israel. Hamas that gets funded by Iran. We cannot have them in the West Bank. We have to control the West Bank. So the hardline Israelis and the hardline Iranians have an interesting relationship in which what one side does enhances the authority and legitimacy of the other. And that happens very often in any kind of conflict. We saw it in Northern Ireland. I mean, frankly, the hardline Unionists and the hardline Republicans, whenever something happened, it would play into their hands. I mean, so in any kind of a dynamic like that, it's actually very common, but we're seeing it as well here. And that was a good question about that.
All right, well, I think our time is about up. Pierre, I want to thank you for thoughtful responses to these questions. I know some of them are pretty difficult. I have about 3 or 4 more I'd like to ask you, but we don't have time for it tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to Betty to kind of take us home. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Don't go away. Don't leave yet. I got a little story to say. You do not disappoint. You do not disappoint. So thank you very much. And I think for those who have heard Dr. talk Atlas before, he has. I want to thank you very much. We want to remind you to come back in 2 weeks. We have Dr. Young Pak, who is going to speak on China's push for global dominance. And just like Iran, China is another very hot spot in the news right now. One of the things that we take great pride in here at ICWA is bringing programs that are timely, they are urgent, and we bring credible speakers. They're just so worth it. So I really hope that you can see that it's really worth supporting us through becoming a member. And a member is just $50, and we don't have any plans for the remainder of this year with doing other things than doing virtual, but stay tuned with us. We will always make sure that we will be offering a virtual program. It might be hybrid. We may never go back to in person because we really love the expanded audience of bringing these programs to you, but we do need your support. But it's going to be a really very good program. Dr. Young Parkway speaking on that. That is 2 weeks from tonight. You do need to register. I think that considering the tentacles that China has right now in too many parts of the world, it's a program you do not want to miss. And then 2 weeks from Thursday, on the 16th, Pierre brought the issue up of the protests and also on women. And there is going to be a program with 3 distinguished speakers. Is there a cultural war on women? It will be talking about the protests in Iran, as well as the situation with women in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world. What is going on? It's this continual battle that women have, and it seems to be erupting. We have 2 incredible speakers, Dr. Saad Rod, who's a fellow, among many other things. Their bios are long. She's a fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation, and Barbara Slavin, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stinson Center at George Washington University. I'm not going to give you their bios tonight. We'll do that when you come back and you see us. But both of these women combined contributed to a number of sources, including, you have probably heard them on NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, read them in Newsweek, heard them on CNN International, and C-SPAN. It's a very impressive list of where they have made a contribution. And you get to hear them here on March the 16th for free, and you get to engage with them. Again, that's the most exciting thing that we offer. You not only get to hear the speakers, you get to actually engage with them. And that is just so cool. You know, Fiona Hill was just on Morning Joe the other day, and I thought, oh, we just had her a couple of weeks ago, and somebody was referring to her as Fiona. I thought, well, we called her Fiona too before the program. And it's just really fun, and you get to engage in that fun with us. It is fantastic. I want to tell you a quick story, Pierre. In Lebanon with the Hezbollah, a lot of people don't know that Lebanon makes great wine, and they have an area up in the mountainous area that is you would think you were in Marin County in California. It is absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful oasis, and they make delicious wines. But it's right in the smack of Hezbollah land. The Hezbollah actually had got a territory that when you enter it, you've got to go through a security check. You have to almost, I thought they were going to take our passports, and they've got posters on the telephone poles of AK-47s in the air and everything. I thought, holy cow, we can just get through the community. Weaved our way through to find these vineyards, and you would have thought that you were walking in a different land. And we had lunch, and people were just clinking their glasses and chattering away, just like they're at some luncheon place in a vineyard in Marin County. And we get back in our car, and we drive through this community, and we see all these AK-47 posters reminding us that we're in Hezbollah land. And I thought, this is how are they letting them stay? Of course, you can't move the vineyards, but I mean, and Hezbollah also has to understand it's a revenue generator. I am sure they're getting some.
That's one of the reasons.
Absolutely, you guys can stay, but anywhere else they would probably slash their bars. But it just is freaky to drive in there through this maze of all these AK-47s. Have a great afternoon at the vineyard and driving through. Very, very strange. But
I'd like to say something real quick before we go. I saw there are still a few people in the audience. I saw a bunch of names of familiar names and friends. I just wanted to say hi to the Mutter Marines. I see Jim and Carol Mutter are on, and they used to come in person, I think, from Brownsburg.
Yes,
and they would drive all the way to they were even possibly all 19 of the great decisions I've done. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well, and thank you very much.
Thank you for pointing that out. There they are, Jim and Carol. Yes. Hey there. Oh, we miss you. This is why we do miss being live, is that we miss seeing our old friends.
This is true. This is true. So I can send you guys the link to the YouTube video of that webinar with the Iranian women, including Dr. Abadi. If you want, I can send that to Ray.
If you would send that to me,
I'll
forward
do
it
that
on to Amy, and she'll post it with the.
It's really it's a 90-minute. It was a really good webinar with questions from the audience. Very, very informative, and it's just a few days old, so it's very timely. And I found it very useful. Well, take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Robin.
Yes.
Great questions, everybody.
And with that,
okay,
we come to that very unpleasant part of the evening where we don't get to sit quietly and walk out the door, taking our time. We have to turn the switch and say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.